Hello and welcome back to another episode of Church is Stupid.
Comma butt.
I'm Ruth,
Hi, everybody. I'm Andy.
and today we have a very special guest with us. Will you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm special.
Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Heidi Kidd, and I work here at the church. I'm a discipleship leader, but as I was sharing with Andy and Ruth, I've done a lot of things. I've worn a lot of hats at this church. Volunteered for a long time. Been here a little over 20-some years, and it's exciting to be on your podcast. So thank you for inviting me.
We're excited to have you. I've wanted to find a good place to plug you in for a while. One, because you have like the best voice ever, for the record.
You're just like scoring points here.
Oh, well, that's my whole point. But honestly, like every time I listen to myself on this podcast, I'm like, who is that screechy female who doesn't stop talking? And then I'll listen to you. I'm like, oh, Heidi's so great. I love her smooth voice.
We all feel like that. It doesn't matter who you are. Listening to yourself or watching yourself on video is uncomfortable. It just is.
It's the worst.
Were you describing Elijah? Is that
Oh, the screechy female?
Yeah, the screechy.
Yeah, it was definitely Elijah. Since he's not here today,
Yeah.
I can pick on him. So today we're going to talk about a little bit about the differences in church and how it's viewed in the different generations, which is actually funny. We have 3 different generations that are represented. So I think we all come from, I know, he reminds me all the time that he's a totally different generation than me.
It
because
100%. It
blah,
depends on where you
blah.
look.
The dividing line
Yeah,
between what, millennial and Gen Z? Are
Yep.
we talking here? Okay.
He's Gen Z, but he's the oldest, basically, or some of the oldest Gen Z.
Yes.
Or you're a zillennial.
So there's this whole thing that in the past like 30 or so years, that there's a discrepancy in the number of generations that there are, because like things changed so quickly based on like what people grew up with.
Right.
And so there is the like end of the millennial generation, which grew up not fully on technology, not fully all that kind of a thing.
Right.
And then there is this time period which some people have defined as the lost generation, which is about a 10-year span in between 1995 and 2005. And like those, they change like depending on who you look at, who you ask. Some people only say it's like 6 years in there, but essentially it's like that time that the shift happened where it was like, yep, everybody has an iPhone. Yep, everybody has it.
Yep.
And so like kids grow up differently. And then you get past that, and then you have we have an iPad, computer, iPhone, like everything that we could ever want, and that's the Gen Z generation, which is like essentially just after that.
Still bummed because I thought they were going to do Gen C for COVID, and then they didn't. So I was like, man, I feel like that defined a generation, but
But the whole technology thing, you're
Yeah.
right, it's changed
yeah.
the way we operate as a society. And you're right, that is a good defining marker, I think, for young
Yes.
people. Let's just say young people
Well,
from
and-
a large age, 30-year.
even for myself being 93, which is unfortunately, according to almost everybody's accepted charts, strongly in that millennial category. Though part of the youngest of the millennials, the way that I have grown up is vastly different than Andy, who's only how many years? Five years younger, and Elijah, who's only 3 years younger. Just because I didn't have a smartphone until I was in college. Like I didn't have access to like Wi-Fi. I think really became a thing when I was in high school. Maybe it wasn't that popular before that. Yeah. Do you even remember a time before? Do you remember dial-up?
I do.
Oh man.
The first house that we lived in, being a pastor's house, essentially, like, we had for the longest time one of those old TVs that like you get the barcode colors on every so often. And I can't even describe this stuff because I was that young.
With like the swoop line that goes, and then it does the lines.
No.
No, you didn't have
No.
one that was that cool.
Maybe? I mean, they were.
You know what I'm talking about, right?
Oh, yeah, I know everything you're talking. I don't go back quite to just radio days. Okay, there was television when I was born. But I'm kind of back there. Yeah, when we only had 3 stations, CBS, NBC, and ABC, growing up, that was it.
I think my mom said, and she listens to this, so she's probably going to yell at me later. It's fine. I think she said she remembers her first color television. But I could be very wrong, and so if I am, Mom, and I'm making you older than you are, I love you. Please don't hate me. I still love you.
Well, I'm 1962. Let's put our cards on the table. So I'm 59. And I do remember color from the get-go. So I don't know. But some shows were only in black and white. So I don't know. You know, some of them, I mean, I still do remember, like, I don't know, I Dream of Jeannie, Captain Kangaroo, whatever. Am I speaking Greek to you?
No, you're not. I Dream of Jeannie is still, I think most people know.
Nick at
You don't know?
Night.
You don't know
I
that?
don't know either one.
I don't know. What was the other one you said? I'm sorry.
Captain Kangaroo.
I've heard of it.
I've heard of that.
Iconic morning show, guys.
Definitely know I Dream of Jeannie. Oh gosh, but it was on TV Land by the time that I would have ever and I only watched like 2 episodes of it, so it was kind of the oldies. But I know, I'm sorry. And actually, I shouldn't say this also on the podcast, but my mom was also born in 1962. So you guys have the same
We're twins.
year. Yeah. Sorry, Mom.
I told you. I know. I can be your mom, but that's okay. We're friends too.
Exactly. It all works out. I like to think I'm friends with my mom. Somewhere she's going, oh no, I don't want to claim you.
You reach that point where it's like, yeah, we're friends.
But yeah, I think that some of these things are a lot more obvious than others. Again, one of the ones, and we've talked about this on this podcast before, that is really, really defining, particularly between millennial and Gen Z, is your knowledge of 9/11 and what happened on September 11th. Because I remember exactly where I was. I remember what happened. I remember watching it on television. I actually remember because my teacher wasn't supposed to show us. And she said it was too important and we needed to watch it on TV. But if I ask Elijah, he sort of remembers the day, but doesn't remember anything in detail at all.
That's a good marker. You're right. Because my oldest is 33. My youngest is 23. And then I've got a 28 and 30-year-old. And same, you know, the oldest one remembers everything she was doing that day, and the youngest was like in preschool. So, you know, it's just kind of a blur. We all got to go home early, and we were all talking about, you know, is the world coming to an end? What's happening? And, you know, people were like, should we go give blood? I mean, there was just this mass, like, what do you do to help in some way, shape, or form? But it was, you know, we had not had that kind of episode on our land, on our, you know, foreign soil, but not here in the States. So it was.
Well, I lived in Port Huron at that time, and Port Huron has the Blue Water Bridge, and so I remember there being a huge scare because anyone that was near any huge landmarks thought they were next, and so it was kind of terrifying, and a lot of people pulling their kids out of school, stuff like that. But yeah, so some of these generational divides I think are a little bit more like overt, where they pretty well defined. I mean, you just don't remember things from your preschool age most of the time, I would say, especially if it's something that didn't happen to you strongly personally. Like
a trauma, right? Yeah. But usually until you get into school, I remember my dad, he was a physician, he'd say, until you really learn how to learn, you don't remember a lot, you know, to like kindergarten.
I never thought about that.
Yeah, I know.
It's kind of true.
Thanks, Dad.
But we don't always apply that to church. And I think that's because church, while it has changed, it hasn't quite kept up on the same scale of change that I would say that the rest of culture has. You know, and a couple of weeks ago, we did an episode on being about 20 years behind, it seems like. But it's because everything has changed so fast. I don't think the whole organization really knew how to adapt to that. But there's also this huge difference between perception of what church is, why it's important, or why it's not important amongst the generations. And so that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today, is just our different views of what was church. I guess I'll start here. What was church like when you were a kid, Heidi?
Well, and when you say church, you know, it just... people think, oh, the building, you know, we've always taught our kids that I've taught here at church. The church is not a building. The church is not a steeple. The church is not a resting place. The church is
the people.
So really, it's not about a building.
That is an old rhyme that I seldom remember.
It's actually a song.
It's a song. That was the song.
That's okay.
There's also here's the church, here's the steeple, open the door and see all the people.
Yeah, exactly.
There's that
That's
one.
How you remember
I don't always remember. It's here's the church, here's the steeple. Open the doors and see all the people.
There's a whole another one that's about a diaper, which is the same hand motions.
Same exact hand.
I
know that one.
Okay, you guys teach me later.
No.
Yep. This must be really interesting for anyone listening who can totally see what we're doing right now.
I know the visuals. We need the visuals.
But
Well,
yeah,
I figured out what
so-
your pictures are for the week.
the instructions.
Well, so the church experience for me growing up, my parents loved the Lord. They were very involved with church. Our lives centered a lot around the church because they both served as like Sunday school teachers. They were very involved with United Methodist Women. My mom was. My dad was an usher. So much of what we did was just, we went to church on Sunday. It wasn't, are we going, aren't we going? That's what we do. You know, that was the dynamic of the Kuhn family. And then eventually we started having a midweek church night. So we all went back down to church for that. And our church was a half an hour away. I went to Metropolitan United Methodist Church, and we lived out in the suburbs. Yeah.
I did not realize you
Chandler
went
and
to...
Woodward Avenue. Big church, but downtown. So to travel 30 minutes to church was kind of a big deal because most people went to a neighborhood church. But it's an amazing place. My parents were married there. We just had so much rich history. So it was just a part of who we were. And I wasn't resentful. I knew that people loved me there. I felt very embraced. You know, I could almost like smell like the congregational dinners and being part of bell choir. It was so much of the fabric of who I was. It was an activity, and yet I knew the nearness of God, I guess, through the worship, but really through the people that were so kind and loving and just seemed to like adore me because I was a little kid in the church running around. And I felt like a second family with the church, if you will. I know that's not everybody's experience, but for me, I did feel loved.
Would you say, now I know you went to church 30 minutes away from home, but would you say that most of your friends in school also attended church? Or was it pretty evenly split?
That's a great question. I had one dear friend that was Jewish, so she,
wonderful.
yep, and the bar mitzvah and all that. So, and another one of my friends went to a different denomination, but a Protestant denomination. Probably 50-50. Some of my friends went, some of them didn't. But they knew, when they came to our house, we'd pray before dinner, and I think they felt the love of Christ, and I think that's the important thing. It wasn't so much about, the Kuhn family goes to church on Sunday, but they felt the love of Christ. My parents were really welcoming, and I love that I could bring anybody home and not be afraid that they're going to be like, this is that church family, and we can't be our real selves. So that was a blessing to have parents like that.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
My other question for you is kind of a two-parter.
Okay.
How full was church on Sunday? And my second part to that is, was there a diverse group of ages that came, or just a diverse community as well?
Yeah.
So I guess three parts.
It was a church in downtown Detroit, and we actually did have an amazing diversity of ethnicity and everything, which was actually pretty cool. And different age groups we did. It was growing up in the late 60s, early 70s. There was a lot of tension, even still in the community of Detroit at that time. But I would say that. Wait, I'm losing my train of thought here. You said, is it? Yeah, yes, there was different generations, and the church had gone through a time where it was bustling, probably during the 50s and all that. Okay. And then it kind of went through a little nosedive. But when I was at Metropolitan, there really was a resurgence of people coming back. And one of the catchphrases I remember being on the front of our bulletin was, the difference is worth the distance. So not only were they appealing to people that lived in the Detroit area, which they did, but all the kind of suburban people, it's this church is so awesome and dynamic. It's worth coming down to the inner city. And we did. But I thought that was a pretty cool catchphrase. Dr. William Quick was our lead pastor.
That's awesome. So now I'm going to go to the complete opposite spectrum.
Okay.
Not complete opposite. Sorry, that sounded way worse than it was. I feel like I'm being very offensive, so I apologize.
No, not at all.
Yeah, no, I was worried. Sorry. I was worried when coming here. I was like, how do I approach this subject without just being completely offensive to one generation or another? And it was
So, Andy, I'm going to ask you essentially the same questions. I'll start with...
I was thinking the whole time.
I believe you. So, first question, what was church like for you growing up? If you took away your pastor's kid experience, but more just in general your experience with church.
See, that was one of my first thoughts. I was going to take it from somebody else's perspective, which actually a very good friend of mine from Lakeview. That's. I don't know how much descriptor you want me to give of her, but a very good friend.
You're fine.
And just with knowing some of her experience, that I can look at it through her perspective a little bit. And I guess my own perspective probably changes it a little bit, but church was very much so a place of community, and more so our Wednesday night than our Sunday mornings. Their entire family would like come, and they would show up, and they would her mother would volunteer, and her brothers and such would also attend youth group, and so it was this like family gathering of such, which made it pretty fun at the very least. But it was also where I know it's where like she built some of her friendships for middle school. Sadly, every single person who was a part of that moved away, which is a whole nother conversation. But then I know that she experienced some hard times. And the thing that I always reflect on with that is that with those hard times, they left the church because they didn't feel supported. And there was this whole like negative connotation that kind of like was put towards their family, that youth group no longer felt like a positive place. And that other things like that, just the community aspect was lost. And so there is that old saying of the church is not the steeple, the church is not the building, the church is the people, and it's this whole thing. But I think, and I guess this is also my personal perspective, that the church has lost this idea of being the people. And that it's very much so just the church is a building. The church is a business. We're here to, monetize things. It's become a lot more negative, I think.
Would you say that a lot of your friends growing up were, like at school, were Christians or wanted to go to church?
See, I reflect on that differently. Because two of my best friends, Nolan and Delaney, they both went to church. But they both went to another church that was not my church. And so there's this whole thing that I remember in third grade when I came and I said, yeah, I'm the pastor's kid, the new pastor's kid. And they were like, you're not our pastor's kid. And then we had this whole conversation because it was like, but you go to church. But you don't go to my church. Wait, there are other churches in the neighborhood.
Revelation.
And
There's
so
other churches.
there was this like entire thing. But like in essence, we had, I don't know, a crap ton of kids that went to the high school, middle school, elementary school. I think I had 5 that I knew, which is like a whole thing. And then like my brother had a group of kids where he knew some of them. And that was his college class or high school class. College. But that was a large church that was in the neighborhood, so it made sense that more people went there. I know that in Whitehall before that, I had no friends at school that went to church with me, and actually just one. But like it wasn't important to talk about church, and so I never figured out like where more people went. Like the only time that I ever figured out where somebody went was when I first came and I was like, yeah, I'm the new pastor's kid, and I had a conversation with like the 2 of my greater friends while I was there. But other than that, I have no idea where kids went to church in middle school. When I went to high school and it became almost more of a political issue of church kind of a thing. Then I got some more understanding of like where people went to church, where families didn't go to church, that kind of a thing. But especially when I was in high school, I didn't have a home church. And actually my home church was in the opposite school's neighborhood, and like it was only our home church for like 2 years. And so there were some people from that church or from the other high school that went to that church. So it was this whole a whole thing, but it was more of a political issue with friends, especially later on.
Yeah, and so reflecting on the churches that you went to, I know as a pastor's kid, again, you went to lots of different churches. Would you say that the sanctuaries were ever really full when you were there? Like on average, were they typically not like? I mean, you can reflect on special Sundays like Christmas or Easter as well, but
so the first church, Whitehall, was pretty much always full.
Okay.
My mom served a double church,
two-part
church appointment there in Whitehall is the name of the place. And so the Whitehall church, which is the main church, was always full. The other one, which is Claybanks, was out in the country, and I don't ever remember it being full. That's like ever. So like Christmas, so like it's Easter, so like all of those. And then I moved to Lakeview, which Lakeview was never full. Special Sundays, all of that. There were 3 rows in the front that never got used.
Yeah.
And so I remember like Christmas services that me and my brother would turn those into like a fort, a place for us to lay down and sleep kind of thing.
It's funny.
And like it was never really full. You go to Traverse City and there was an entire balcony that was never used.
Wow.
Like a full wrap around the entire sanctuary, never used.
So in that group of people, or in those groups of people, did you see a lot of diversity in age as well as in general?
In Lakeview, for sure, I saw a lot of diversity in age.
Yeah.
That may have just been involving myself in the youth programs more. Whitehall was very, very older. There was a lot of like VBS that would be loaded with kids. Like anything that was a special event would be loaded with kids. Your Wednesday night, like so many of the youngers. The Traverse City was a lot better at it. That was where we definitely saw like generations come together. But there was also a college in that town. There was also like families that lived in that town. There was like most of the churches were reflective of the actual like generations that were present.
Okay.
Is what I would say.
That's fair. That's fair. Same with just diversity in general.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I know you don't have the demographics in front of you of every single place you ever lived, but which makes
every place that I've ever lived has just been really, really white, and so it's been really reflective in the churches.
And so, I'm going to save my big question until our second episode.
Okay.
But for myself, growing up, actually, let's see, church was always really important in my family. And it wasn't just church, it was being a Christian. That was the really important thing. I went to church camp every year of my life. That's where I gave my heart to Christ. But I always saw the church as people instead of buildings, which I think came from that natural tendency to flow in and out of so many different church buildings through my dad's position, through just moving even before my dad became a pastor. We kind of, there was just, that was a fluid thing to me, but church was always very, very different to me than Christian. And that's not because I didn't think Christians went to church, but because the people who really impacted my life were Christians that I met outside of the church. Most of the time. It would be people, the Christians that I often saw inside the church from my growing up experience after my father became a pastor, because I don't remember all that much. I do remember some things about my church experience prior to my dad becoming a pastor, but not much. But most of the time when I interacted with church people, it was to be yelled at. Because I was a kid and I wasn't doing what I was supposed to be doing, or it was because they wanted to complain about something my dad was doing as a pastor. It was to complain about my generation as a whole. That often happened. I didn't have any friends who went to the same churches that I did growing up. Youth group wasn't really a thing. It was kind of a thing, but not really. And my church experience was very much so based in I guess, curmudgeons. Is that the fair way to say it? Very curmudgeon-y. It was older generations, so it was older people. That I used to joke, these are terrible jokes that you make as a pastor's kid, perhaps. But I used to be terrified growing up that I would come to church one day and everyone would have died and no one would be there. And that was like a fear. That was a fear that I had because I'm like, nobody's going to be here. And then I also, because my name's Ruth, and there obviously aren't that many people my age who have the name Ruth, though it is
Love
making
your name. Love your name.
a resurgence. I'm very grateful for that. But thank you. I would say I chose it, but I had nothing to do with it. And so in school, if anybody said Ruth, it was very obviously about me. But in church, it'd be like, Ruth broke her leg this week. I'd be like, no, I didn't. And then I'd have to remember there was like 3 90-year-old women named Ruth who were in the church. So that was kind of the only place that I had people who shared my name, I guess. But I was never turned off to Christianity because those things were always so separate in my head. Because church was not a place that I necessarily felt super welcome when it came to the people inside the church. I always felt very comfortable in the building itself because I was a pastor's kid. So we talked about this last week. I go everywhere in every church building I've ever been in. It's obnoxious, but it's fun. And
but that is sad that you felt the brunt of maybe some of the complaints and some of the stuff that was going on in your dad's life, but it's good that it didn't embitter you.
Yes.
I mean, that's actually kind of surprising, maybe, that you haven't just
and that's
thrown out the church, got everything in one basket and said, okay, these people aren't showing me the glow of
absolutely.
Christ. So that's
I attribute that 100% to my parents, and to them intentionally putting people in our lives who showed us that Christianity was way more than just that Sunday experience, that it was so much more, and really, really developing our relationships with God. They didn't tell us what to believe, but they showed us, they lived out through their lives what being a Christian looked like. They lived out their faith. It was so easy to me to separate those because my parents were just not what I saw on Sunday. I mean, obviously I saw them on Sunday, but my dad especially, he just has this passion for ministry. I mean, he's a second career pastor, and it's just so evident when you talk to him. He is so on fire for God all the time. I mean, my mom is as well, but just getting to see him up there and hear him talking about the ministries that he wants to be doing, and him struggling as well with, okay, I want to push this church, but they're not listening. So what do I do? How do I balance these things? I watched him go through the same struggles that I went through. And so I was able to see that you can differentiate. You can still love God and you can still love Christianity without thinking the church is perfect or without forcing that experience to be the only one.
Yeah, because I think we've, sadly enough, sometimes isolated church to the Sunday morning experience. Yep. And that's an important time, for sure, for Christians to come together. Oh, yeah. I mean, we're called to gather as a community. But it's so much more than that, right? It is. It's so much more than that. So, and sadly, if somebody gets turned off because of something that happens on a Sunday morning at the worship hour, then they kind of just throw the whole thing out. And that's sad. That is, because that's not how God would have it. So...
Absolutely. And growing up, from the time I was in quite a few different school systems, but my primary one was Elginak schools. And I mean, I had some people that I knew were Christians, but by being Christian, it was more like they said they were Christian. Not very many people that I knew that attended church. Some that did. The other pastors' kids in town did. But not really. I think I had one person that I went to school with that attended my church on occasion, maybe like once a month, sometimes more, sometimes less. And other than that, the Boy Scouts were in our church, so I saw some of my friends from that every once in a while, but that was the extent of it. I mean, my best friend in high school was not a Christian. My other best friend in high school, I know I had two, I'm weird, but my other best friend in high school was a Christian, but I don't think they really attended church. And so I grew up, and the way that I grew up in millennial church, in my personal experience, was a very negative outlook on church itself and on what that experience would be. And that's what I would what I would experience when I went to school was like, oh, you go to church, like, why? It doesn't really matter. Or like, I'm a Christian, but why would I go to church? Like, all sorts of things, because it just wasn't, it either wasn't relevant or it just wasn't interesting in any way, shape, or form. And so that was kind of my experience growing up in church. So those are our 3 generational differences, and we're going to continue this conversation on our episodes next week. I'd like to remind you that you can check out some of our supplemental content on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. And also that we have a Church is Stupid, but Bible study that goes along with our first 10 episodes, with episode 11 coming out now. And I have been informed that some have been looking for it and didn't realize that we're not publishing it on this page. It's actually on its own separate page, and it's called Church is Stupid, but Bible Study Edition. And it is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, pretty much all the places this one is, but it does have a different name. So if you want to find that, you do need to look that up under that name. So from all of us here at Church is Stupid,
but
I'm Ruth.
I'm Andy.
And I'm Heidi.
We hope you have a great week.